Now that we have our categories created, let's create a controller that will allow us to return a list of categories from our database. PHP artisan, make controller, category controller. I want to create one method that will return a list of my categories and the subcategories. So public function, and because this class actually only includes one method, I'm just going to call it the invoke method. We don't really need the request object in here. Categories equals, as we have said before, we want to use actions to interact with the database. So let's create an action that will be responsible for getting the list of categories and sending back to the controller. So PHP artisan, make action, and that will be category, get all categories, action. And in here, we're just going to call that action class, get all categories action, run. So let's go over to the action class itself and write the function for getting the categories. So we're just going to return category has children. So here we are only interested in returning the top level categories. Okay, so has children is a trait or is a scope on the model which is introduced by the class that we installed or the package that we installed, the has recursive relationship trait here, and it has a method called has children which scopes this model to only return parent categories, so categories that have children. So category has children, we want to load with it all the children. So if it is a category that has children, then we want to eager load the children to each of the parents. And you can do this with an inline function by just saying with the children, and it receives the query. So we want the children ordered by the sort order. Okay, so it returns a list of all the children for this category, for each of them categories, and it will order that by the sort order. Then we can also order the base categories by the name or whatever field you want to do. So remember here we are eager loading the children. So the order by that we specify in here is applied to the children for each category. But outside of that order by, we are also ordering the parent categories by some field. In this case, we are ordering it by the name. And then we can just do a get. Okay. By returning that, we can directly return the categories to the front end. But I don't want to do this. Of course, we already talked about using API resources to control what we expose to the front end. So I'm going to create a category resource. So PA, make resource, category resource. And if I open that, we can specify what we want to return. So ID, this, hash ID. Again, we mentioned that in the front end, all we want to expose are the hash IDs. And in the back end, we know that we can resolve that to the actual IDs. The name will be this, name, the slug, this slug, and this merge when, and we're going to talk about what that means. When this is not a parent, so when this parent ID, then we want to load the children. And the children will also be an instance of the category resource and a collection of it. So the children will be one or more, right? So it's a collection. And so here we'll just say static collection, this, when loaded, children. So let's look at what we did here. All of this is no news. We already know that we can return the fields from that model instance. So the ID, name, and the slug, that's what we already know. Merge when you use this in a resource class, is a conditional field, which means that we will only merge this field when this condition is true. In this case, we only want to have children if the model we are looking at is a parent. And how do we know that it's a parent? We know that by checking to make sure that the parent ID is null. Okay. Now we also only put the children when we have eager loaded the children. And this helps us escape what we call the n+1 problem. So if we also don't load the children, even if it's a parent and we didn't eager load the children, then this will not be appended. You won't have a children in the response. But in our case, of course, we said get all categories action. We are eager loading the children, so we expect to see the children loaded for every parent category. Now let's go back to our API route and create a route for this. So if you go to API, we want to be able to access categories even when we are not authenticated. So I'm not going to tie that down to an authenticated route. Route get, and I'll just say categories. So if we just go to API/categories, then we should be able to get that. And here, category controller class and the invoke method. So back to our controller here, instead of returning categories, we return a category resource collection. And we'll pass the categories that we'll get from the action. So over here in Postman, we already have a route for categories. And if I send a request, then we get a list of categories and their children. Again, as we mentioned, you only get the children if the category is a parent. In this case, we have a parent, which is business, and we have the children. But if you look at communication, it is not a parent category, so we don't have the children appended to it. Also, if you go back to the routes file, remember that here we are calling the invoke method on the category controller. But something to note here is that because we are using invoke, which is a magic function in PHP, that will be the default method that the route will look for in the controller, regardless of whether we specify it here or not. I can comment this out and I can just call that class without the invoke method explicitly. And by just specifying category controller class, Laravel knows that it will be looking for the invoke magic method. And if I try to get that, we still get the exact same result. So do whatever you want here. You can use the invoke method and be explicit, which is what I like to do in general, or you can just specify the class itself and you get the results. Now, if I go back to the actions here, I comment the eager loading and I go back to my front end and I try to retrieve this, you'll see that we only get the parents, we don't get the children. And that comes back to the point that I mentioned, that in your resource, if you do not append or you do not eager load the children relationship, then that is also omitted from the response. So Laravel will try to optimize this to avoid the n+1 problem, and we only load this when the children class is eager loaded. In this case, let's just put it back because we want the children to be part of the response. Get it? And we are back to business.